How does a flat bar compare to a riser bar on a mountain bike in terms of the way it rides and handles? That's the question I'll attempt to answer in this video. When I built my giant Anthem up a year ago, I used a bar that only had a 5mm rise, which is pretty flat. I'm going to be replacing it with this bar, which is also a race face, and this has a 20mm rise, so this is definitely more of a riser bar. I've typically run riser bars even on my cross-country bikes. When I had 29ers a few years ago, I even ran a riser bar on those, and I would just flip the stem upside down to have a negative rise on the stem so I could still use a riser, because I like the way that a riser bar puts your wrists in a more natural motion. I think it's easier on your wrist, and I also like the way that it affects the handling of a bike. So this is the current bar. It's got an 8-degree back sweep, 5mm rise, and it's 720mm wide, and I actually trimmed it down to about a 700. And the riser bar that's going on it has an 8-degree back sweep as well, 4-degree up, 20mm rise, and it's 725 wide. Now when I put this one on, I'm not going to trim it at first. I'm going to ride it for a week or two before I decide if I want to trim it. Now it's time to do a little surgery on the bike and change out the bar. The bar is installed, and now it's time to go hit the trails and let you all know what I think. Okay, so I got about 2 hours of riding on this handlebar, and let me let you guys know what I think about it. The riser bar, the upsweep on a riser bar is what really gives it the feel. In other words, it comes kind of up into your hand and gives you a little bit more natural feel. And what that does is it allows your steering inputs to have a little bit more power. In other words, the bike is a little bit easier to initiate a corner because the handlebar is just, again, it just kind of sits up in your hand a little bit easier. So that's the first thing that I noticed. Another nice advantage of a riser bar is obviously that it's a little bit higher, so you don't feel like you're kind of too far over the bike and plowing into obstacles. If your weight is too far forward, even though you can get a little bit better feel of the front tire and put a little bit more weight and get a little bit more grip, when you come into rough sections, you can kind of feel a little bit too, I guess top heavy would be the best way to say it. In other words, you're just kind of plowing into the obstacles and feeling like you may go over the bars a little bit easier, you know, when you're going downhill or rough stuff. So you've really got to find that balance. If you're too far back or too high, you're going to lose traction on the front wheel. Riser bars typically are wider than a flat bar, so keep that in mind. That's why you see riser bars on trail bikes. One of the reasons is because typically the bars are wider. Also on trail bikes you want to be a little bit higher so you're more capable when going downhill and especially over rough terrain. So let me talk about the width of a bar, because that's really important. The wider the handlebar, the easier the bike is going to be to kind of whip around. The bike is more sensitive to steering inputs as the bar gets wider. However, the downside of a wider bar is you kind of lose some feel on the front wheel. So when you're going around a corner and it's maybe you're on some pine straw or leaves and it's kind of slippery, if the bar is a little bit more narrow, you can kind of feel the front wheel a little bit better. Whereas a wider bar, you just kind of lose that sensitivity. But because the wider bars, especially when you're higher, because they allow you to turn the bike easier, you're going to have less upper body fatigue. And speaking of fatigue, when you come up a little bit higher, you can also have less back fatigue. So if any of you all out there have some lower back issues, you may want to get your weight a little bit higher, either by moving some spacers below your stem, in other words bringing your stem up, or looking into a riser bar if you run a flat bar. Now the downside to a riser bar is if you're already pretty high on the bike, especially if you ride a 29er and you're about as high as you want to be, even with the stem low and maybe even flipping the stem to a negative rise, then a riser bar is probably not going to work out for you if you don't want to be any higher. But like I mentioned earlier in the video, Even when this is a 27.5, but even when I was riding 29ers, I would keep the stem flipped around to a negative rise so that I could run a riser bar. Just because it has a more natural feel. And so I ran the flat bar on this bike for a year. So switching to a riser bar, I like the difference. I didn't have, I've only ridden 2 hours so far, but I have not had any kind of wrist pain or anything like that. A couple years ago, when I had been riding a riser bar for a while, I rented a bike out west in Arizona, an Anthem 29er, and it had a flat bar, and about an hour and a half into the ride, I started to get wrist pain. So if you guys are using a flat bar, or girls, and you maybe have some wrist pain or lower back pain, you're probably going to benefit from switching to a riser bar. So those are my thoughts. Again, pay attention to handlebar width. Cross-country bikes, and let me mention this. Cross-country bikes have steeper head angles, which also causes the bike to be more sensitive to steering inputs, which is one reason you don't see cross-country bikes with really wide handlebars, is because if the bars get too wide and you have a steep head angle, the bike is going to be extremely sensitive to steering inputs. So again, keep that in mind, and you can kind of, if you want to move your hands in while you're riding and see what I mean, again, you'll feel the front wheel a little bit better when your hands are in closer, but you have more power and more control. And another thing that I noticed on this bike when I switched to the riser bar today is that I was able to get the front wheel up easier over obstacles. So I just feel like I have a more kind of more command over the front of the bike with the riser bar, whether that's getting the front wheel up or just kind of whipping it around corners. It did take me about 20 minutes to get used to it because the front end, I almost oversteered it. Part of that's the riser, but I think more of that is the handlebar width. Like I said, this is a 725 millimeter width. This is about as wide as I would want to go for a cross-country bike. Any wider, I think, is just it's gonna cause the bike to be too sensitive to steering inputs. So I would say about 680 millimeters to about 725 is the range that you would want to go for cross-country. Now, if you're riding trail bikes, you can go even wider than this. I personally probably wouldn't go wider than about 730 on a trail bike, but if you're riding really rough stuff, then a wider bar is going to give you a lot of leverage over the front end. So that'll do it for this video. Hopefully these tips and feedback on the bar swap that I did, it will help you choose which one is right for you. Thanks for watching.